It's Johnny Two-Face here, back with another reaction video. This time I'm reacting to another series from Kings and Generals. It's called Battle of Narva 1700 Great Northern War Documentary. Now, as I said, this is from Kings and Generals, and I've never heard anything said about this, or read anything about it. So basically, as it says in the description here, that the Great Northern War, the early modern era conflict that changed the balance of power in northeastern Europe for centuries, allowing Russia of Peter the Great to become an empire, while Sweden under Charles XII and the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth ruled by Augustus II began declining. This video will cover the background of the war and events that led to hostilities, as well as the famous Battle of Narva in 1700. So anyway, I thought this will be an interesting series to react to. So anyway, the usual disclaimer when I react to any historical content: if I am, excuse me, if I don't show so much what is considered a proper reaction, is probably obvious that I don't know much about the subject at hand, and if I do know anything, I'll most likely pause video, give my input, or ask any curious questions, which hopefully will be answered in the comments below. So without further ado, the link to the original video will be in the description down below. Please go and subscribe to Kings and Generals and support their channel, and check out their sponsors if you're interested. So without further ado, let's get this up on screen and let's see what happens. Nope.
The Great Northern War marks the culmination of the tumultuous past couple of centuries in Northern Europe. This war not only changed the balance of power in the region, but on the continent as a whole. At the end of the conflict, one of Europe's newest and most militarized powers lay in ruins, and from its ashes, an empire previously on the fringe of European affairs would start its explosive rise. In this episode, we will talk about the events that led to the beginning of the Great Northern War, and cover the Battle of Narva, one of the most interesting engagements of the era. Speaking of interesting, the sponsor of this video, Gemstone Legends, is one of the coolest new puzzle RPG games in 2021.
I'll just skip forward.
With great workmanship, this beautiful game is available for free on iOS and Android. According to one of our team members which stipulated that inherited a multitude of conflict regarded of Gustavus Red will be waiting for you.
Feel free to check him out if you're interested.
The ascension of Gustavus Adolphus to the throne of Sweden in 1611 is generally regarded as the starting point of the Swedish Empire.
Okay.
The able young king inherited a multitude of conflicts in the region, most notably the Ingrian War against the Tsardom of Russia.
Okay.
The war was concluded with the Peace of Stolbovo in 1618, which stipulated that Sweden would gain Ingria and parts of Karelia, thereby denying Russia access to the Baltic Sea. Russia, which was still recovering from the time of troubles, was unable to offer any significant resistance to Swedish expansion. The war with Poland-Lithuania, which had been sporadically raging on since 1600, was concluded in 1629. Gustavus Adolphus was...
Just to get this out of the way, I didn't know Sweden had an empire, and I knew they were in conflict with Russia, but I didn't know they were at war with Poland and Lithuania at the same time.
Not able to force Sigismund III of Poland to renounce his claims on the Swedish throne, but he was able to keep most of Livonia, including the important port city of Riga, and gain valuable trade concessions. In 1618, one of the most destructive conflicts in history, the 30 Years' War, had started as well. Although the last phases of the Swedish-Polish War are considered to be a part of the 30 Years' War, the Kingdom of Sweden did not involve itself directly in the war before the King of Denmark, the former champion of Protestantism, had been defeated. Worried about Catholic domination in the empire, Gustavus Adolphus, who was a leader of a Protestant nation himself, intervened on the Protestant side. Although the Catholics were close to a complete victory, the Swedish involvement changed the tides of the war. Sweden's superior army dominated the battlefield even after the death of Gustavus, and by 1648, the war was grinding down to a stalemate. Large parts of Europe, especially the Holy Roman Empire, were left decimated, demographically, economically, and militarily. In contrast, the Kingdom of Sweden, by acquiring territories in Pomerania and Bremen-Verden at the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, became the preeminent power in the Baltic region and one of Europe's leading states. Sweden may have been the dominant power in Northern and Eastern Europe.
I wonder if these Swedish territories were an annoyance to Denmark, or did Denmark really not care about how close Swedish ports were?
However, its supremacy in the Baltic was incomplete. Only several years after the Peace of Westphalia, they went to war against Poland in what became known as the Deluge. Even though the Swedes were dominating for most of the war, by the end, the coalition assembled against them proved to be too difficult to deal with, and peace was signed. The peace was a merely symbolic victory for Sweden, as the Polish monarchs finally abandoned their claim to the Swedish throne. Moreover, it also proved that the Kingdom of Sweden could not survive for too long against an organized coalition of enemies. Charles XI ascended to the throne of Sweden in 1660, and the majority of his rule was peaceful, barring the relatively short Scanian War of 1675 to 1679. During the war, Sweden conquered Scania from Denmark, but lost some of its lands in Germany, mostly due to the inefficiency of the army. After the war, Charles XI revitalized the economy and administration of Sweden. However, his most notable reforms were of a military nature. Those reforms aimed to make the Swedish army one of the best in Europe. Charles XI's death in 1697 left his only son, Charles XII, as the new Swedish king. As Charles XII was barely 15 at the time, Peter I of Russia and Christian V of Denmark saw this as an ideal opportunity to exploit Sweden's apparent weakness. On the 21st of April 1699, Russia and Denmark concluded a treaty of mutual assistance in future wars against Sweden. One of the secret articles of the treaty, however, stipulated that Russia would only join the war after it made peace with the Ottoman Empire. Shortly afterwards, Peter concluded a treaty with Augustus of Saxony, who was also the elected ruler of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Augustus was a very proud and extravagant ruler, and his main goal was to return Livonia to the Commonwealth. Livonia, although a land that brought insurmountable wealth to the Swedish crown, was also a source of great concern. After Sweden had gained Livonia in 1629 through the Treaty of Altmark, it gave certain assurances to the old Livonian nobility that they would preserve the rights that they had had under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and that they would not lose any of the lands that were in their possession. For the first couple of decades, the relationship between the Swedish monarchs and the Livonian nobility was amicable. Charles X, however, was not as lenient as his predecessors, and by 1655, he intended to revoke a quarter of the lands that belonged to the Livonian nobility, only with the Second Northern War preventing him from doing so. Charles XI would turn his father's plans into a reality after ascending to the throne, and by the time of his death in 1697, the Livonian nobility held only a fifth of the original number of estates. One of the nobles, Johann Reinhold Patkul, outraged by the Great Reduction, agitated the Livonian nobility to rise up against Sweden in rebellion. He was swiftly arrested and sentenced to death, and to avoid execution, Patkul fled from Sweden. Patkul later played a key role in the formation of the anti-Swedish coalition, as he was usually the diplomatic link between Peter, Augustus and Christian, and provided intelligence on the Swedish defences in the Baltic. Sensing the impending danger, Charles XII sent diplomats to Russia in the summer of 1699, with the goal of confirming a peace treaty between the two states from 1661. A skillful diplomat, Peter the Great assured the envoys of his peaceful intentions, but in reality he had already decided to go to war. Augustus II also sent a diplomatic envoy to Sweden, assuring the king of his friendly intentions and asking for Swedish mediation in a dispute between himself and Prussia.
Okay.
While all of these dialogues took place, the coalition continued its preparations for war. Ultimately, the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp became alarmed by the Danish naval buildup and informed his ally Charles XII of what had been transpiring. Though both the Swedes and Holstein had tried to resolve the matter peacefully, the new King of Denmark, Frederick IV, refused to negotiate. The first act of war was committed by Frederick's troops in March of 1700, when the Danish army entered lands belonging to the Duke of Holstein and shortly afterwards laid siege to Tønning. Simultaneously, on the other side of the Baltic Sea, Saxon forces under Augustus entered Livonia and captured the port of Dunemunda. Charles XII, together with his war council, seeing the Danish threat as more immediate, decided to strike at them first. Great Britain and the Netherlands were uneasy at the prospect of a destructive war in the Baltic, as they had trade interests in the region. Fearing that the conflict might destabilize their economies, the maritime powers deployed their fleets to Øresund to ensure that no lasting harm to trade and their merchants would be done. By August, a Swedish force of 16,000 had assembled in Scania. Though attacking the main Danish army and lifting the siege of Tønning seemed like the most secure way to deal a decisive defeat to Frederick IV, Charles opted for the riskier option of attacking the Danish mainland itself. The Swedish fleet, with Charles himself and his troops on board, managed to outmaneuver their more formidable Danish counterpart and make contact with the British and Dutch fleet. The maritime powers were willing to assist the Swedish king, so the Danish fleet was forced to retreat to Copenhagen. Skillfully avoiding parts of the island where coastal batteries were present, Swedish troops subsequently disembarked on Zealand. The Danish mustered up around 700 men and 7 artillery pieces to attack the Swedish disembarking forces. However, they were no match for the 2,500 Swedish soldiers led by Charles himself. It was here that Charles XII saw battle for the first time and proved himself an excellent leader, being the first one to jump into the water and lead the assault. The Danish were caught completely by surprise with this move and were starting to panic, as the Swedish army was within a stone's throw of their capital. A few days after Charles set foot on Zealand, more Swedish soldiers landed there as well, and preparations were made for the march on Copenhagen. Meanwhile, the Swedish, Dutch and British fleets blockaded and started bombarding Copenhagen from the sea. With Copenhagen surrounded on both land and sea, Frederick IV of Denmark made peace with the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp, and peace with Sweden was achieved soon afterwards as well. On the 18th of August,
sorry if this sounds dumb for me saying this, but I didn't know Britain and Holland were involved in the Great Northern War. And I suppose, in a way, if all this sees in a war zone, it will affect trade. But I knew Sweden had Pomerania, which I'm guessing is around here, but I didn't know they had territory down here on the other side, just underneath Denmark.
1700, the same day that peace was made between Denmark and Sweden, Peter I of Russia declared war on Sweden and began his offensive into Ingria.
Narva.
The first target of Peter the Great's campaign was Narva, a crucial fort near the Baltic Sea. Peter besieged Narva with an army more than 30,000 strong and with more than 150 cannons. Such an artillery force would have reduced Narva to rubble, were it not for the fact that the Russians suffered from a lack of ammunition due to bad roads. With trouble brewing in the west, in what would become the War of the Spanish Succession, the fleet of the maritime powers transported the Swedish army back to the mainland before setting sail westwards. As the Swedish army was fully united, Charles was able to set sail for Livonia. Though Dunamunda fell to Saxon forces quickly and with little resistance, Patkul gravely misjudged the loyalty and intentions of the Livonian nobility. He had expected the Livonian nobility to join Augustus and Riga to fall quickly too. However, Livonian support was minimal, and Saxon forces alone were not strong enough to take the city. Learning of the Danish defeat, Augustus II retreated across the Duna River in hope that Charles would agree to a ceasefire. Charles arrived with a part of his army in Pernau in autumn. As Augustus retreated beyond the Duna River for winter quarters, Charles decided to head towards Narva and the Russian army. The rest of the Swedish War Council, along with foreign emissaries, tried to persuade Charles to postpone the attack on the Russian army until after the winter had passed and the army was united. Charles, however, wished nothing other than to meet his enemy in open battle, and not even the knowledge of the size of the Russian army could dissuade him. While marching towards Narva on the 7th of November, a part of the Swedish army clashed with a Russian raiding party under the command of Boris Sheremetyev at Jõhvi. Although the Russian raiding party suffered relatively heavy casualties compared to the Swedish ones, General Sheremetyev became aware of how far the Swedish army was from Narva. On the 18th of November, Charles XII arrived with his army at the village of Lagena, about 8 kilometers away from Narva. Seeing that many of the horses were ill and that there was heavy snowfall, he knew he needed to act quickly. As soon as he was certain that
so
Narva
basically
had
force a
not fallen
decisive battle.
and that his men were ready, Charles left Lagena. Meanwhile, the Russians, being aware that the Swedish army was on its way, began defensive preparations. Trenches were dug around the Narva River's meander, and wooden stakes were placed in the center on the Goldenhof Hill. There were 2 rows of ramparts running alongside the trench as well, and between them there were soldiers' barracks. Several artillery batteries were placed along the trenches, although they would not have any effect on the battle, as the Russian army ran out of ammunition several weeks before. Sources differ when it comes to the exact size of the Russian army, but modern estimates agree that they had between 35,000 and 40,000 men at their disposal, with the overwhelming majority being infantry. The Russian forces were stretched for over 6 kilometers on their side of the trenches. The Russian army was under the general command of Peter I and Field Marshal Fyodor Golovin. The right wing of the Russian forces were commanded by General Avtonom Golovin, the center by Ivan Trubetskoy, and the left by Adam Verde. The Russian cavalry, placed on the far side of their left wing, near the bank of the Narva River, was commanded by Boris Sheremetyev. The Swedes had around 9,000 men, out of which 5,500 were grenadiers, 3,500 dragoon cavalry, and 37 cannons. The army was split into 2 relatively equal parts.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't dragoons are just infantry on horseback that ride to the battlefield and dismount to fight on foot? Or are they actual cavalry that prefer to fight on horseback? But I know for a fact that grenadiers are made from the tallest and strongest men in the army. Anyway.
The right wing contained 3,000 grenadiers and was commanded by Otto Welling, a veteran of the Scanian War. It was divided into 3 columns, with the one in the center being smaller and being hollow in the middle. The left wing was divided into 2 groups, with one being commanded by Field Marshal Carl Gustav Rienschold and the other by Magnus Stenbock. Rienschold had around 1,500 infantry, divided into 2 columns, while Stenbock had 1,000 infantrymen under his command. The Swedish cavalry was positioned on the flanks, mostly in order to guard the infantry against Russian flanking maneuvers. Charles XII himself led the cavalry on the left flank. The Swedish Artillery Corps, under the command of Johan Hublad, had 16 artillery pieces placed in between the left and right wing of the army, and 21 were positioned on the left wing. Moving his army through the forest and barely passable trails, Charles reached the outskirts of Narva and positioned himself on Germansberg Hill. After performing reconnaissance of the Russian defences, at 10 AM on the 19th, Charles positioned his army in preparation for battle. He was hoping to meet Peter on the battlefield. However, the Tsar had left Narva the day before the battle, taking Fyodor Golovin with him. The command of the army was passed to Charles Eugene de Croix, a Saxon diplomatic envoy to Peter. De Croix, aware of his lack of military skill, was initially unwilling to take command of the army. However, it is said that Peter convinced him over a glass of wine. Afternoon Golovin, Bieda, and Trubetskoy were just as inexperienced as de Croix was. The most capable Russian commander at Narva was Boris Sheremetyev, although he was passed over for holding a lower rank than the others. The Russian commanders, even though fielding a superior force, were unwilling to commit to open battle, fearing that the Swedish army that they were seeing was merely the vanguard of a much greater unit. The battle commenced when Charles ordered his soldiers to fire 2 volleys at their enemies and advance towards the trenches. At 2 PM, the weather changed. A heavy snowstorm and hailstorm started, and the wind was blowing directly in the face of the Russian soldiers. Using the snowstorm as a screen, Charles ordered his men to fill up the trenches with fascines and start directly assaulting the Russian positions. In less than 15 minutes, the Swedish infantry filled up the trenches enough for their cavalry to pass. The Russian soldiers did not see the Swedes until they were right in front of them. The infantry under the command of Rienschold quickly captured the artillery batteries in the center, while the infantry under Stenbock directly assaulted the Russian army. Due to the number of barracks and the bad positioning of the Russian ramparts, the Russian troops did not have much room to maneuver, and brutal close-quarters combat ensued, where the Swedish soldiers had the clear upper hand. Due to the relentless Swedish assault and the surprise of the attack, the majority of the Russian right flank descended into complete disarray. A large number of the soldiers fled towards the bridge to the north. Few managed to escape though, as the bridge collapsed under their weight, taking many men with it to the bottom of the river. Many of the Russian soldiers tried swimming across the ice-cold river as well, with almost all drowning in the process. The soldiers who were left in the trenches also started to flee, only to be forced back by Charles's dragoons. The only part of the Russian right which still posed some organized resistance were the elite Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky guards. They created a wagon fort on the far side of the Russian right wing, near the Narva River. Continuous assaults against the wagon fort did not yield any results, and the Swedish army suffered heavy casualties. In the meantime, the Swedish right wing saw as much success as the left. The Russian forces were quickly routed, and part of the Swedish right was able to join the left wing shortly afterwards. Sheremetyev, seeing that the cavalry would be useless in this type of close-quarters combat, fled southwards. De Croix, also aware of how dire the
should have kept them there, use them as shock troops.
Decided to surrender to Charles. As night began to fall, the battle became even more fierce and bloody. Charles drew up many of his footmen in between the city and the entrenchments, so that he could not be surprised.
You don't hear this much in this era of warfare, the 17 or the 1800s, fighting when the sun goes down.
From any side, wishing to cut the lines of communication between.
But I suppose with the distinct colour in uniforms, they can easily tell who's who, even in the dark.
What was left of the Russian army's wings, Charles ordered Hublad to capture the artillery battery on Goldenhof Hill. By morning, General Golovin surrendered as well. His troops were allowed to keep their arms, as Charles admired the bravery of the 2 elite guards. General Bieda, learning of the surrender of the right wing, subsequently surrendered the left wing. After receiving the arms and standards of the left wing,
Wow.
Charles allowed the rest of the Russian army to leave over the bridge, which his forces had already repaired. The battle was a catastrophe for the Russians, as their casualties amounted up to 10,000 men, with De Croix and most of the other commanders ending up as prisoners. The Swedish army, on the other hand, lost less than 1,500 men.
Wow.
To make matters worse for the Russians, the Swedes had captured 143 cannons and 28 mortars, almost the entire amount of artillery that Peter the Great had at his disposal, as well as the entire Russian baggage train. The Battle of Narva confirmed two things to Europe: that the Swedish army was one of the best, and that the Russian army was as ineffective as it was large. Charles XII, merely 18 years of age, proved that he was a more than capable military commander who, backed by an army of as great quality as the Swedish one, could overcome the insurmountable odds that were stacked against him. With the victory at Narva, a complete Swedish victory in the war seemed like a distinct possibility. On the other hand, knowing that his army was merely beginning to reform, Peter the Great was not disheartened, and he famously remarked, "They have beaten us, they might beat us again, but in time they will teach us how to beat them."
Okay.
Our series on the Great Northern War will continue soon, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see the next video in the series. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing. Get early access to our videos, access our Discord and much more.
And that'll do it. This has been another interesting video by Kings and Generals. Yeah, as I said, this is a series. This is a war I don't barely know anything about. So hopefully we've all learned something. So anyway, that'll do it. If you like this reaction, please like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next